Hey boys and girls, I'm so glad to be with you this morning. We've been talking about mothers in the Bible. And the first mother we talked about was Eve. And she was the first mother ever. Then another mother, not necessarily the second mother, but another mother that we talked about second was Sarah. And Sarah was Abraham's wife and Isaac's mother. And then today we're going to talk about how Abraham found a wife for Isaac when he grew up, and her name was Rebekah. So they'll be talking about Rebekah today. Now Abraham and Sarah had baby Isaac. We talked about that last week. And once he grew up, Abraham wanted him to marry someone who would love God just like his family did. And none of the girls there in Canaan believed in God. They didn't believe or worship God. So Abram decided to send a servant, and he's Abraham now. So Abraham decided to send a servant to his homeland to find a wife for Isaac. And if you remember, that land was named Ur. So the servant went to Ur, and at the end of his journey, he came to a well where the young women were having a chance to visit, but they also were drawing water for their families. And he prayed, and he asked God to guide him to the wife that God had chosen for Isaac. And the way he would know it was by her answering in a certain way when he asked for a drink of water. She was to say, "Yes, you may have a drink, and I'll draw water for your camels too." Now the servant saw Rebekah coming from the well, and he asked her for a drink. What do you think she said? That's right. She answered just as the servant had prayed she would. So he knew she was the one. Yes, Rebekah was the one God chose to be Isaac's wife. She would be a part of carrying on the line of the Savior and the blessing that Abraham was given by God for all of his descendants, which means all of his children. That's what descendants is, that they would be as numerous as the stars and the grains of sand. So Rebekah played a very important part in all the great-grandmas and grandpas of Jesus. And you want to know something even more interesting? Rebekah was Sarah's great niece. How about that? So Sarah was her great aunt. That means that Sarah's nephew's daughter was Rebekah. Ooh, I have to think about that for a minute, don't you? Well, anyway, the servant told Rebekah what he wanted, and she took him back to her family, and he talked to Laban, her brother, and his mother, and they realized that it was God's will for Rebekah to go to Canaan and marry Isaac. So she left and went with the servant back to Canaan, and she married Isaac. Now they had been married for a while, and Isaac started praying that God would give them a child. Now God waited for 20 years before he answered their prayers. But when he didn't just give them one child, he gave them two twin boys, and they named the boys Esau and Jacob. Now Esau's name means thick hair, and he was very hairy skin and hairy arms and hands and legs. And his brother, who when he was born was holding on to the heel or the back of the foot of Esau, was named Jacob because that means heel catcher. Now, before the babies were born, God told Rebekah that the son who was born second, meaning Jacob, would rule over the firstborn son, which means Esau. Now, in those days, the oldest son was in charge of the family when the father was away, and after the father died, he inherited twice as much of the land and the money and the servants as the other sons did. So it was very unusual for God to choose Jacob to be the one to get the inheritance of the family. These special privileges were the oldest son's birthright, but God chose Jacob. So the father's blessing, now the birthright was the land and the money and everything. The blessing that the father gave could be things like ruling over the people or being rich in your area. But in Isaac's case, the blessing was the promise that God had made to Abraham. When God chose Jacob to receive Isaac's blessing, God chose him to be God's own special servant and a part of his family. And he received the promise of many descendants, which means many, 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 many children. And he would be a part of the lineage, which means all the people, the great-great-greats of Jesus. Now, do you know any twins? We have some twins who are in our church, and I can think of them right quickly. Do they always look alike? Well, some twins look exactly alike, so much so that we can't tell them apart. And other twins don't look alike at all. And in some cases, it's a girl and a boy, so they definitely don't look alike. And that's the case with Esau and Jacob. They looked very different, and they enjoyed different things. Esau was big and strong and hairy, and he liked being outdoors and hunting. And as he grew up, he didn't obey God, and he didn't care about God's promises. Jacob, on the other hand, was very quiet, and he liked to stay at home around the tents, and he liked to cook. So one day, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in, and he had been hunting all day. And he says, "I'm starving. Let me have some of the stew that you're making." Well, now Jacob took advantage of this situation, and he said, "I'll give you some of it if you sell me your birthright." Well, Esau was hungry, so he didn't think anything about it, and he sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. Now, can you see this picture? So this is Esau. He's been out hunting, and he's hungry, and he asks Jacob for some stew, and Jacob said, "Sure, I'll give you some stew, but you got to sell me your birthright." So do you think that was an even trade? Not at all. Esau sold his birthright, which meant lots of money and lots of privilege, to Jacob, and all he got was a bowl of stew. Wow. Now, Rebekah heard what had happened, and since Jacob was her favorite son, she wanted him to get everything. She wanted him to get the birthright and the blessing. So she kind of started making plans about how she would help Jacob get the blessing. So this situation is bad because Jacob is her favorite son, but it's even worse because Esau was Isaac's favorite son. So parents should not do that, but these parents did. Both parents had a favorite son. Now, many years later, Isaac was growing old, and he was blind, which means he couldn't see. He thought he would probably die soon. So he asked Esau to go out and shoot some wild game, which is wild animals, with his bow and arrow. Bring them back to the home and cook them, and bring the meal to him. He promised after he had eaten, he would give Esau his blessing. Now, that was wrong because he knew that God had told Isaac and Rebekah that Jacob should get the blessing. But since Esau was his favorite son, he thought he would give it to him instead of to Jacob. So now Isaac's not obeying God. Well, Rebekah heard Isaac talking to Esau, and she decided this was time to put her plan into place. So she called Jacob to her, and she said, "Bring me 2 goats from the flock, and I will cook them, and you can take the food to your father, pretend to be Esau, and he will give you the blessing." Well, Jacob looked at her, and he said, "That won't work. Surely, even though my father can't see me, if he feels my smooth skin, he'll know I'm not Esau because his skin is rough and hairy. And then I'll be more in trouble than before, and I will not be blessed." Now, think about this a minute. Did Jacob not like his mother's plan because it was wrong? Or did he not like it because he thought he was going to get caught? And the answer is he thought he was going to get caught. So he was not sure he wanted to be a part of this plan. But Rebekah had it all figured out. She covered Jacob's hands and arms with the hair from the goats. Now, this is just a picture of what it might have been like with her sewing the goat hair around his arms. And then he put on some of Esau's clothes so he would smell like Esau to send him in with the food. So, Jacob takes the meal in to Isaac. And Isaac says, "Come over here so I can touch you and be sure you are really Esau." So the plan is working because Isaac can't see, but he feels the goat hairs on Jacob's arms. And he says, "Well, you really feel hairy, so are you really my son Esau?" And then Jacob lied to his father and he said, "I am Esau." And then Jacob put his hands on his head and Isaac put his hands on Jacob's head and gave him the blessing. Wow. Now, God had already promised this blessing to Jacob. So Rebekah and Isaac did not need to get in the way and mess up the plan because God already had planned it. So he didn't need their help. They were just trying to push things along a little bit. They weren't patient. So their lying and their scheming was to no good because God can do anything. And they needed to be quiet and still and listen to what God wanted them to do. So they sinned because they didn't trust God to fulfill his promise. Now, right after Jacob left his father's cabin or cottage or room or wherever he was, Esau came in with the food that he had prepared for his father. Isaac sadly, immediately realized what Jacob had done. Now Esau begged him to give him the blessing anyway, but it was too late. Once a blessing is given, it's given, and it cannot be taken back. Esau was so angry, he said, "I am going to kill Jacob." Now, Rebekah made her trick on Isaac even worse by lying to Isaac and telling him that she wanted to send Jacob to her brother's family to find a wife, rather than take a chance on his marrying one of the pagan women where they lived. And in Genesis 28:5, we are told that Isaac agreed and sent Jacob on his way. So Rebekah helped Jacob run away to get away from Esau. And he left Canaan, the land that God had promised to give him. And he went to be with his uncle Laban, now that's Rebekah's brother Laban, in the land of Ur, and he stayed there for 20 years. So Rebekah lied to Isaac. Oh, all these lies and schemes and deceit and bad things going on in this family. Now Rebekah never got to see her favorite son Jacob again because she died before he came home. Have you ever said something that you were really, really sorry you said and you wished you could take it back? Maybe it was something hurtful, or maybe it was a fib or a lie. And somebody might even look at you and said, "You take that back." Well, you can't unsay something. Once you've said it, it's out there and people have heard it. And when you lie, something really bad, it's bad and you can't take it back even if you're sorry after you lie. You can apologize and you can ask to be forgiven, but you can't change things. That's why the Bible tells us to be careful about what we say. And of course, one of our 10 commandments tells us not to lie. The people in families are not perfect, and we all sin and hurt each other. But God is always in control, and he was in control over the situation with Rebekah and Jacob and Isaac and Esau. And he will watch over us and forgive us when we ask him to. Now next week, we'll find out what happened to Jacob and Esau. And until then, mwah!